first shot didn't come from a gun. It came from a syringe. A man stumbled through the emergency entrance of Harrow General Hospital at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, bleeding through his jacket, his lips already going gray. He grabbed the sleeve of the nearest nurse, a woman with dark hair pulled back, quiet eyes, ID badge reading Mara Voss, RN, and he pulled her close enough that she could smell the copper on his breath. "They're already inside," he rasped. "Don't let them take me. Don't—" Then his eyes rolled back and he went down. Mara caught him before he hit the floor. In the same instant, the front doors of Harrow General exploded inward, glass shattering across the waiting room linoleum, and 4 men in tactical gear flooded through the gap, with rifles raised and faces covered, and absolutely no intention of asking anyone's permission for anything. The screaming started immediately. And Mara Voss, 29 years old, 3 years into her nursing career, known to her coworkers as the quiet one, who always finished her charting on time, went very, very still. Not from fear. From something older than fear. If you've made it this far, don't stop now. Follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. Harrow General was not a glamorous hospital. It sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell, a mid-sized city that had spent 40 years trying to decide if it was industrial or suburban and had never quite committed to either. The hospital itself was functional rather than impressive. 12 floors, 340 beds, a level 2 trauma center that handled everything from farm work accidents to the occasional gunshot wound from the rougher neighborhoods near the river. The staff were competent, overworked, and perpetually underfunded. The parking garage leaked. The cafeteria coffee was a running joke that nobody found particularly funny anymore. Mara had come to Harrow General 3 years ago carrying 2 suitcases, a nursing license, and a history she had professionally omitted from her employment application. The omission wasn't illegal. The files that might have explained it were classified at a level that most HR administrators didn't know existed. She had passed her background check without incident, which told her exactly what she needed to know about the depth of that check. She liked the work. She was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with her previous life and everything to do with the part of her that had always wanted to fix things rather than break them. She learned patients' names after one introduction. She caught medication errors twice in her first month and reported them quietly, without drama, which earned her the respect of the attending physicians and the mild resentment of 2 nurses who had been on the floor longer and felt they should have caught those errors first. She did not talk about herself at department parties. She did not date anyone from the hospital. She went home after her shifts to a 1-bedroom apartment 3 miles away, cooked dinner, read, slept, and came back the next morning. Her coworkers described her, when asked, as nice. A few of the sharper ones said capable. Her supervising charge nurse, a brisk woman named Donna Haverford, who had been in the field for 22 years, had told her directly during her first performance review, "You're the calmest nurse I've ever worked with, and I don't know if that's a gift or a problem." Mara had smiled and said, "Probably both." Donna had written excellent stress management in the comments box and moved on. The Tuesday night shift, before everything changed, had been routine until it wasn't. The ER was running at about 60% capacity. A couple of car accident victims. A man with chest pain who turned out to have a panic disorder and not a cardiac event, 2 children with high fevers, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Paulina Garrett who had come in complaining of dizziness and was now on her 4th hour of observation while insisting loudly that somebody bring her the remote control for the television in Bay 4. Mara was coming off a medication run when the paramedics came through the doors. The man on the gurney was maybe 50, with a broad chest and a face that had been handsome before someone had worked it over. He was conscious, but barely, holding his side with both hands, and the paramedic briefing as they transferred him was terse. Gunshot wound, right flank, through and through, BP 90 over 60 and dropping, found him on Sutter Avenue outside the warehouse district. Doctor. Ramona Pell, the attending on duty, took the case immediately. Mara assisted while they got him stabilized, cut away the jacket, got IV access, called for imaging. The man was trying to say something the whole time, but his mouth wasn't cooperating with his brain in the way it needed to. "Sir, you need to stay still," Mara told him. She was pressing gauze to the exit wound, which was messier than the entry, and monitoring his blood pressure with the peripheral awareness of someone who had done much worse in much worse conditions. "We've got you. What's your name?" His hand came up and grabbed her wrist, not grabbing for help, grabbing with intention. "Dalton," he said. It came out like gravel in a tin can. "My name is Dalton." "Okay, Dalton, we need you to—" "They're going to come for me." His grip tightened. His eyes were more focused than they had any right to be given his blood pressure. "They're already tracking the ambulance. Do you understand what I'm telling you? They don't care about this place. They don't care about the people in it. They are coming." "Sir, listen to me." He pulled her closer with a strength that shouldn't have been there. "They found me." Then his blood pressure crashed, his eyes rolled back, and Dr. Pell pushed Mara aside, and the room filled with the sound of orders and equipment, and the particular controlled chaos of a team trying to keep someone alive. Mara stepped back. She stood at the edge of Bay 3 for 3 seconds. 3 seconds that nobody else in the room noticed because they were doing their jobs. And she thought about what the man had said. The way he'd said it, the specific phrasing, "They don't care about the people in it. Not there will be trouble or call the police." The grammar of someone who had been in situations like this before. She walked calmly to the nurse's station, picked up the desk phone, and called hospital security. "This is Mara Voss in the ER. We have a GSW patient with a possible threat situation. I'd like someone down here, please." The security officer on duty, a heavy-set man named Carl, who Mara had spoken to maybe 4 times in 3 years, arrived 7 minutes later. He stood in the ER corridor looking mildly inconvenienced and asked if she'd gotten any specifics. She told him what Dalton had said. Carl nodded slowly. "Sounds like he might be disoriented. GSW patients sometimes." The front doors came in, not opened, in. The automatic mechanism was bypassed by something blunt and fast, and the safety glass shattered in a cascade across the entrance floor, and the 4 men who came through were moving with the clipped, purposeful economy of people who had rehearsed this exact entry. Carl's hand went to his radio. He didn't get to use it. The first man through the door swept the security officer aside with a forearm that sent him into the wall, and then the rifle came up and the voice behind the mask said, loudly and clearly, to every person in the Harrow General Emergency Room, "Nobody moves, nobody talks. You stay where you are and you stay quiet, and none of you have to get hurt." The screaming lasted about 4 seconds before the second announcement, delivered at higher volume, made clear that screaming was not going to be tolerated. After that, there was the kind of silence that has texture to it. The silence of 30-odd people, patients, visitors, nurses, one attending physician, trying simultaneously to become smaller than they were. Mara was not trying to become smaller. She was standing near the nurse's station, and she was counting. 4 men through the front. She could see another 2 moving past the exterior windows toward the ambulance bay, which meant they were covering secondary access. The 4 inside were positioned without being obviously coordinated about it, which told her they were trained but not military. The spacing was instinctive rather than deliberate, tighter in corners than it should be for a room this size. The weapons were M4 variants, suppressed. That detail was important. Suppressors meant they weren't planning on announcing themselves to the street. They were planning on this being quiet. That was bad. Quiet meant they intended to be done before anyone outside knew what was happening. The lead man, she could tell he was the lead because the others checked his position before moving, a small but consistent tell. Walked through the waiting area with his rifle at a low ready, scanning faces. He was looking for something specific. Looking for someone specific. He was looking for Dalton. "Where's the man who came in on that ambulance?" he said to the room at large. "GSW victim came through about 15 minutes ago. Someone is going to tell me where he is." Nobody answered. A child in the waiting area. A girl, maybe 7, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, started to cry. Not loud, just the trembling, can't-stop-it crying of a child who had decided the world was no longer safe and couldn't find her way back from that conclusion. The lead man's attention went to the sound. He walked toward the girl. Mara moved. She stepped between the gunman and the child before the calculation was fully conscious. One moment she was behind the desk, the next she was in front of a rifle, One hand on the child's shoulder, body angled to block the girl from the man's direct line of sight. "She's scared," Mara said. "She's 7. Can we just move? She's not a threat to you." He looked at her. The mask covered his face, but not his eyes, and the eyes were assessing her the way people assess things they're considering discarding. "You volunteering to be difficult?" "I'm volunteering to keep a child from having a panic attack in the middle of your operation," Mara said, "which I'd think you'd want because a panicking child is noise, and you came in here suppressed, which means you don't want noise." A pause, short but real. "Smart nurse," he said. "Mara," she told him. "And you still haven't answered my question about the girl." "Fine." He gestured with the rifle barrel toward the cluster of chairs along the wall. "Put her with the others. You stay with her. You're going to be my problem to manage." Mara guided the little girl, whose name turned out to be Petra, and whose mother was across the room trembling with her hands raised, toward the group of civilians being corralled in the waiting area. She sat Petra down, positioned herself between the child and the nearest gunman, and quietly took inventory of everything she could see. 2 exits visible from her current position, the destroyed front entrance and the door to the main hospital corridor, which one of the men was guarding with his back to the wall. The ambulance bay doors were presumably covered. The stairwell door near the nursing station was currently unguarded, but the man near the corridor could reach it in under 10 seconds. The ceiling. She looked at the ceiling. Standard hospital infrastructure. Drop tiles, lighting grid, HVAC vents. The kind of sprinkler system that required significant heat activation. She noted the placement of the security camera in the corner above the triage desk. Its red indicator light was still on, which meant someone was watching. She hoped someone was watching. The lead man found Dalton in Bay 3. Mara couldn't see it directly, but she could hear it. The spike of voices, Dr. Pell's controlled objection, a crash that might have been a monitor being knocked over, and then the quiet again that was somehow worse than the noise. 2 of the gunmen moved in that direction. The one nearest the civilian group, a lean man with a military-style watch on his left wrist, stayed put, eyes moving across the hostages in the pattern of someone keeping count. Petra had stopped crying. She was sitting pressed against Mara's side, the stuffed rabbit held with both arms, and she hadn't made a sound since Mara sat down. There was something in the child's stillness that was almost eerie for her age, as though she had intuited that stillness was the correct response and committed to it completely. "What's the rabbit's name?" Mara said softly. The gunman's head turned slightly in their direction. "Benny," Petra whispered. "Good name." "Is Benny brave?" A tiny pause. "He's scared?" "That's okay. Brave and scared aren't opposites." The gunman looked away. Mara returned to counting exits. The thing nobody understood about Mara Voss, not her co-workers, not her charge nurse, not Dr. Pell, who had worked alongside her for 2 years, was that the stillness they read as calm was not the absence of response. It was the management of response, the discipline of keeping the body quiet while the mind ran at operational speed. She had learned it over 4 years in a unit that did not appear on any publicly available military organization chart. The unit had a designation that changed periodically for administrative reasons, and a mandate that was described, in the documents that referenced it at all, as direct action and sensitive site exploitation. What that meant, in practice, was that Mara and the 11 other people she served with went places where the situation had already gone wrong and made it less wrong by whatever means were available. She had been a medic first. That was the thread that connected her 2 lives, the deep, irreducible need to keep people from dying. In the unit, she kept people alive long enough to get them out of places where staying meant certain death. Now she kept people alive by managing sepsis protocols and medication timing and the 1,000 small decisions of acute care nursing. The methods were different. The orientation was the same. She had left the unit at 26, not because she couldn't do the work, but because 2 of the people she'd gone in with hadn't come back from the last deployment, and she had stood at a crossroads and made a choice. She filed her paperwork, sat through the exit processing, and disappeared into civilian life with the quiet efficiency she applied to everything. She did not miss it. She missed the people. She did not miss the work. What she had not expected in the mathematics of that choice was that the work might eventually find her. 40 minutes into the hostage situation, the lead man came back to the waiting area. He stood in front of the group of civilians and he looked at each face in the systematic way of someone who had done this before, and Mara could see from the set of his jaw that whatever he'd found in Bay 3 had not given him what he wanted. Dalton was alive. Whatever information the man needed, either Dalton hadn't given it or Dalton wasn't in a condition to give it. "The patient in Bay 3, the lead man said. "Who admitted him? Who's been treating him?" Silence. "I'm not asking out of curiosity." "I admitted him," Mara said. He looked at her. "Come here." She stood, said something quiet to Petra that made the child press herself into the chair and stay there, and walked across the waiting room floor to where the lead man stood. She had about 4 inches of height disadvantage and a significant disadvantage in hardware, and neither of these facts were of particular concern to her. "What did he tell you?" the man said. "His name and that he'd been followed. That was it. He lost consciousness right after." "He didn't give you anything? A drive, a document, anything physical?" "He grabbed my wrist," Mara said. That was the extent of it. The man studied her for a moment with the particular intensity of someone trying to determine if they're being lied to. "What's your read on him?" The question surprised her. Not much surprised her anymore, but that one landed at an angle she hadn't expected. "My read is that he's lost a significant amount of blood, and his pressure has been unstable for the last 40 minutes, and if your plan involves him being conscious and coherent, you have a narrow window." Something shifted in the man's eyes. Not warmth, nothing like that, but a recalibration of some kind, like he'd expected a different answer and was filing the actual one away. "You stay near me," he said. "Okay," Mara said. She didn't argue. She wanted to be near him. She wanted to see what he was doing, where he was looking, how he communicated with the rest of his team. She wanted every data point she could collect. She walked back to check on Petra first, which was a small act of deliberate normality, and in doing so, she passed close enough to the supply corridor entrance to note something that stopped her for a fraction of a second before she kept walking. A thin wire. Visible only at the base of the door frame, running along the floor, color matched to the baseboard in a way that was almost invisible to someone not looking for it. She kept her face entirely neutral. She kept walking. Her mind was running calculations she hadn't run in 3 years, and they came back with a speed and clarity that told her some things don't actually leave you. They just wait. By the time the police arrived outside, the situation inside had settled into the particular awful stasis of a hostage crisis in its early phase, the point at which the initial shock has passed and the waiting has begun, and nobody knows yet how bad it's going to get. Mara knew it was going to get very bad. The wire at the supply corridor was the first one she'd spotted. In the next 20 minutes, using the limited movement available to her in her role as the lead man's assigned problem, she identified 2 more, one near the utility access panel at the north end of the ER, one running up the wall behind the nurses' station toward the ceiling infrastructure. These men had not arrived tonight and installed those wires. These wires had been here before tonight, which meant someone had been inside this hospital before the crisis began, which meant the timeline was longer than it appeared, which meant the hostage situation, Dalton, the rifles, all of it, was not the operation. It was the cover for the operation. She did not allow herself to think about the implications of that at full volume. Not yet. She filed it in the compartment where she kept things that needed to be processed later and kept her expression at the careful neutral she'd been holding for the better part of an hour. Outside, through the cracked front doors, she could see the red and blue of police lights painting the parking lot. 2 patrol cars initially, then more. And then, arriving without lights or siren, moving with a quietness that only looked unremarkable if you didn't know what to look for. A dark green vehicle, unmarked, that parked at the edge of the lot rather than with the police units. A man got out. Gray-haired, moving the way certain people of a certain age and background move, economically, without wasted effort. He stood looking at the building for a moment. Then he said something to the police officer nearest him. Mara couldn't hear it, but she watched the officer's reaction, the slight straightening, the quick compliance, and she understood that whatever the gray-haired man had said, it had established something. One of the other gunmen moved to the window and looked out. Cops are setting a perimeter, he said. They'll negotiate, the lead man said. We have time. What about the soldiers? A pause. The lead man's gaze went to the window briefly. What soldiers? That green truck. That's not a cop. The lead man went to the window. He looked out for 5 seconds, and when he turned back, his posture had changed in a way that Mara clocked immediately. Not obvious, not dramatic, but present. The specific shift of someone who has just learned that the situation has a variable they hadn't accounted for. Outside, the gray-haired man was now on a phone. Mara watched him. Something moved in her chest that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite dread. It was the particular feeling of a door you thought you'd closed for good swinging back open. She turned away from the window. Petra was watching her from across the room, small and steady, with her stuffed rabbit held against her chest, and Mara gave her a look that was meant to say it's okay, even though what it actually said, what the child probably understood in the wordless way children sometimes do, was not yet, but stay still. In Bay 3, the machines monitoring Dalton's vital signs began an alarm. The lead man's radio crackled, and somewhere in the ventilation system above the emergency room, something Mara couldn't quite identify made a sound that wasn't the HVAC. Her name came over the radio before she understood it was coming. The lead man held the radio to his ear, listened for a moment, and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read behind the mask, but could read in the body. That recalibration again, deeper this time, like he was looking at something and seeing something else. Your full name, he said. What is it? Mara Voss, it's on my badge. Your full name, middle name. She looked at him. Why? He didn't answer. He looked at the radio in his hand, then at her, then back at the radio. Whatever had come over that channel had been short, under 10 seconds. But it had done something to him that 40 minutes of planning and tactical control hadn't managed to do. It had made him uncertain. Stand here, he said. Don't move. He walked to the far corner of the waiting room and made a call, voice low, turned away from the room. Mara stood exactly where she'd been told to stand and watched the remaining gunmen and noted their positions and waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was sometimes the most active thing you could do. When the lead man came back, he looked at her differently. Not with fear, not yet, but with the particular quality of attention that comes when someone has learned that what they're looking at is not what they thought it was. Who are you? He said. Not an accusation, almost a genuine question. I'm a nurse, Mara said. He stared at her. Outside, the gray-haired man had moved closer to the building. He wasn't with the police line. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, 20 feet from the shattered front doors, which was insane by standard tactical protocol. Exposed, visible, no cover. Not insane if you were making a point. He wasn't looking at the building generally. He was looking through the broken glass of the front doors, past the gunman at the entrance, across the waiting room floor, directly at Mara. And he was waiting. The lead man followed her gaze, looked out at the gray-haired man, looked back at Mara. What is this? He said quietly. Mara didn't answer. The machines in Bay 3 were still alarming. Petra had her rabbit pressed so tight against her chest the stuffing was probably compressing. And somewhere below them, below the floor, below the emergency room's foundation, something that sounded like a timer was running, and Mara was the only person in the building who understood what that meant. The timer sound was irregular. That was the detail that mattered. A standard countdown mechanism ran smooth and mechanical, the kind of tick you could almost ignore if you tried. What Mara was hearing through the floor had gaps in it. Not the gaps of malfunction, but the gaps of a system that was cycling through multiple nodes, checking status, confirming connectivity. She'd heard that pattern before. Once, in a building in a country she was not officially in, 40 seconds before she and her team had to leave through a window on the 3rd floor. That had been a 6-device network. She didn't know yet how many devices were here. The lead man was still looking at her. He'd asked his question, "What is this?" and gotten no answer, and he was trying to decide what to do with that. Behind him, the gunman at the entrance corridor had half turned toward the conversation, and the one near the civilian group had his eyes moving between Mara and his team leader with the antenna up attention of someone who senses that the plan has developed a problem. Outside, the gray-haired man hadn't moved. "Tell your people to step back from the explosive entry points," Mara said. The lead man went very still. "The supply corridor door, the utility panel on the north wall, the nurse's station access." She kept her voice even, the same tone she used to explain a medication change to a patient's family at 2 in the morning. Informational, not threatening. "The wire I can see along the baseboard is older than tonight. Whoever wired this building, it wasn't your team, which means someone ran a separate operation through your operation, and you have people standing next to detonation hardware they don't know is there." He stared at her. "I could be wrong," she said, "but you should probably check." For 3 seconds he didn't move, and Mara watched the calculation happening behind his eyes. The rapid reassessment, the instinct to dismiss what she'd said fighting with the colder instinct that recognized specific knowledge when it heard it. The word baseboard. The word nodes. The particular precision of someone describing something they'd actually seen versus someone guessing. He got on the radio. Low, fast. She caught fragments. Check the corridor door. Look for wire along the base. Don't touch anything. And then the response came back, and whatever the man on the other end said made the lead man's jaw tighten in a way that confirmed what Mara already knew. "Who told you?" he said. "Nobody told me. I walked past it." "You walked past it and recognized it?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't predicted. He pulled down the lower half of his mask, exposing a face that was younger than his voice had suggested, mid-30s, with the particular weathering of someone who spent a lot of time outside in bad conditions. He was letting her see him, which was either confidence or a threat or both. "Who are you?" he said again. "I already answered that." "Not completely." She didn't respond. He stepped closer, not aggressive, calculated, testing the distance. "The man outside in the green truck, you know him." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You looked at him the way people look at someone they recognize from a long time ago." He paused. "Or someone they used to work with." Mara said nothing. She had 11 years of training in not saying things, and she applied that training now with the same precision she applied to everything else. The lead man read her silence correctly. "This has gotten complicated," he said quietly, and it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like someone talking to themselves. "It was already complicated," Mara said. "You just didn't know all of it yet. But the next 20 minutes were the worst kind. The kind where you can see what's coming but can't yet do anything about it." The lead man pulled his team into a tight huddle near the corridor door, positioning himself where he could watch both the hostages and the hospital entrance. Mara stayed where she'd been told to stay, which put her at the edge of the civilian group, close enough to Petra that the girl could reach out and touch her sleeve if she needed to. Petra did not reach out. She sat with the rabbit in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance with a stillness that Mara found simultaneously impressive and heartbreaking for a child that age. Petra's mother, a woman in her 30s named, Mara had learned in the snatches of quiet conversation she'd managed, Sandra, was 3 chairs down, and the effort of not moving toward her daughter was visible on her face. Her hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate rigidity of someone using physical control to contain something that would otherwise come apart. "She's doing great," Mara said quietly without looking at Sandra directly. Sandra's breath stuttered. "She shouldn't have to." "No, she shouldn't." That was all. There was no frame to make it better, and Mara didn't try to find one. The honest acknowledgement seemed to do more for Sandra than reassurance would have. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the rigidity in her hands eased, and she looked at her daughter with something that was still fear but had a little more steadiness behind it. Mara returned her attention to the room. The lead man's huddle had broken up. His team was repositioning, 2 men back to the corridor and the ambulance bay, the lean man with the military watch staying near the hostages. The lead man himself walked to the entrance and looked out at the police perimeter, and Mara watched him look specifically at the green truck and the gray-haired man still standing 30 feet from the door. Then he picked up his radio and said something she couldn't hear, and she watched his face when the response came back. And the response was not what he wanted. She was running out of time for passive observation. What she needed was a reason to move. Hospitals provided them if you knew how to read the room. The machines in Bay 3 had been alarming on and off for the past 15 minutes. Dalton's pressure was unstable, which she'd told the lead man and which remained true. An unstable patient in a monitored bay created noise and justified movement and gave her coverage that a direct approach wouldn't. "Your patient is going to die," she said to the lead man when he came back from the entrance. "That's not my problem." "It might become your problem, depending on what he has that you need." She said it carefully, not too pointed, letting him draw the conclusion himself. "If he dies before he tells you where it is, then you've run a full hostage operation in a hospital for nothing." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to go treat him?" "I want to keep him alive long enough for you to talk to him, which also happens to be my job." She watched him weigh it. The calculus wasn't complex. She was either a threat or a resource, and a dead asset in Bay 3 was no good to anyone. "Ty," he said, and the lean man with the military watch looked up. "Go with her. She goes to the patient, does what she needs to do, comes straight back." Ty gestured with his chin toward the bay corridor. Mara walked ahead of him, pace unhurried, hands visible, and she used the 40 feet of corridor between the waiting area and Bay 3 to look at everything. The utility panel she'd identified earlier was on her left. She let her eyes rest on it for half a second, long enough to confirm what she'd seen and not long enough to signal anything. The wire ran up the left side of the frame, thin as a phone charger cord, painted over except at the very base where the paint had chipped. Professional installation, not rushed work. This had been done with time and access, which meant inside help or a very good breach during a period of low occupancy. She cataloged the detail and kept walking. Bay 3 was a controlled disaster. Dr. Pell was in the corner of the bay, sitting on a rolling stool with her arms crossed and an expression of contained fury that Mara recognized. The specific face of a physician who had been told not to do her job and was handling it very, very badly. Two of the gunmen were in the bay, positioned near the equipment rather than near the patient, which told her they were guarding the room rather than managing Dalton directly. Dalton himself was semi-conscious, gray-faced, with his pressure reading 84/58 on the monitor and his heart rate at 112. He'd been intubated at some point during the crisis. The tube was in and the capnography was reading, which meant Dr. Pell had done that much before being sidelined. The IV line was running, but at a maintenance rate, which wasn't enough. Mara looked at Pell. "He needs fluids pushed." "I'm aware," Pell said with the particular dryness of someone who had been aware of this for some time. "I need to adjust his line." Pell looked at Ty, who was standing in the doorway. Ty nodded slightly. Pell gestured at the supply cart. Mara moved to the cart, pulled what she needed, and went to Dalton's IV with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She was aware of Ty watching her, and she worked in a way that was visible and deliberate, nothing quick or concealed, making it easy for him to see that what she was doing was medical. What she was also doing, with her back to Ty and her body positioned between his line of sight and the bed, was looking at Dalton's right hand. He was holding something, small, thumb drive, possibly, or something shaped like one, tucked against his palm with his fingers curled around it in the particular way of someone who has decided not to let go of something even while unconscious. She kept her face neutral and her hands moving on the IV line. "Dalton," she said quietly, close to his ear. "I don't know if you can hear me, but you need to hold on to that." His fingers twitched. Barely. She straightened, checked the monitor, said to Pell, "He's going to stabilize in the next 20 minutes if we get his pressure up. He won't be coherent, but he'll be alive." Pell looked at her with that physician's fury still banked behind the professional mask. "Good to know what the bar is tonight." Mara looked at her directly. "The bar is everybody in this building goes home." Pell held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of two people who have independently arrived at the understanding that the situation is much worse than it looks. "The little girl in the waiting room," Pell said. She's okay. For now." Ty stepped into the bay. "Time to go back." Mara gave the monitor one last look, fixed the drip rate, and walked back out. In the corridor on the walk back, she fell half a step behind Ty in a way that wasn't obvious. He didn't correct it. The gap between them was barely a foot and a half. Not enough to matter in his assessment, probably, because there was nowhere to go in a sealed corridor with armed men at both ends. He was wrong about where you could go in a corridor, but she wasn't ready to use that yet. What she was ready to use was what she'd confirmed in Bay 3, which was this. The devices she'd found were networked. The network was already armed, and Dalton was carrying something that multiple groups, possibly including the lead man's team, and certainly including whoever had wired this building, wanted badly enough to tear a hospital apart for. The hostage crisis was the distraction. The building was the target. And whoever had planned the second operation, the one that had prepositioned wires and devices and timers inside a working hospital, had done so knowing that the first operation would bring law enforcement and military assets to the perimeter, meaning the explosion, when it happened, would occur in front of the largest possible response infrastructure. That detail was not tactical. It was designed for impact. She was back in the waiting area before she finished the thought, and the first thing she saw was that something had changed. The gray-haired man was no longer visible through the front entrance. The second thing she saw was Petra. The girl had moved, not far, just forward from her chair, and she was looking at Mara with an expression that had something different in it than the controlled stillness of the last hour. Not panic, more like the face of someone who has seen something and doesn't know what to do with the information. Mara sat down next to her. "What did you see?" she said, very low. Petra leaned close. Her voice was barely air. "The man in the ceiling." Mara didn't look up. Her jaw was the only thing that moved, and it moved fractionally, because she had checked the ceiling in this room. She had checked it, and the vents were standard 12 by 12 hospital infrastructure, which was too small for, not for everything, not for everyone. The gray-haired man had not walked away from the building. The gray-haired man had found another way in. She kept her breathing exactly as it had been, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance, and she processed the new information with the specific discipline of not processing it at full volume, because the lead man was 15 feet away, and the lean man with the watch was 5, and neither of them could know what she now knew. "You're very observant," she told Petra, quiet enough that it was almost not sound. "My dad says that too," Petra whispered. "Your dad's right." She spent the next 10 minutes demonstrating no change in behavior, which was the hardest thing she'd done all night, because what she wanted to do was move. Position. Map the angle of approach from the ceiling relative to the armed men's positions. Determine how long a deliberate infiltration route through Hospital HVAC would take and how close the gray-haired man might already be. She did none of that. She sat. She checked on Petra. She watched the room. At minute 12, the lead man's phone rang. He answered it, and this time he didn't move away for privacy. He stood in the center of the waiting area, and his face during the conversation was the most readable she'd seen it, not because he'd let his guard down, but because whatever he was hearing was bypassing the guard entirely. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. When he lowered the phone, he looked at the device for a moment like it had said something in a language he didn't know. Then he looked at Mara. "That was your people," he said. She was careful. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He walked toward her with a deliberateness that made the lean man step back to give him room. "They called the number I use for operational communication. They knew the number. They gave me your name, your full name, not what's on your badge. And they told me something." He stopped in front of her. "They told me you're the only person in this building who knows where all the devices are." The room was very quiet. Not hospital quiet. A different quality of quiet. The kind that arrives when a number of separate threads simultaneously become visible as part of the same knot. "Is that true?" he said. She looked at him. "I know where 3 of them are." His jaw worked. "How many are there?" "I don't know yet." "How do you not know?" "Because I've been sitting here," she said, and let the rest of the sentence fill itself in. He took a breath. Let it out. The professional architecture of his demeanor was still there, but it was carrying more weight than it had been built for, and the cracks were becoming apparent. His operation had depended on a series of factors remaining stable, the patient cooperative, the police manageable, the building controllable. and every one of those factors had developed complications that his pre-mission planning hadn't accounted for. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I need to move through this building." "That's not happening." "Then you need to tell me the layout of your personnel positions so I can determine which zones are unmonitored and where." "Also not happening." "Then we have a problem," Mara said, "because the devices in this building are not yours, which means you don't control them, which means whoever does control them is going to run their own timeline, and that timeline has nothing to do with your operation. You have," she said, and she said it as plainly as she would have read a blood pressure result. "Maybe 40 minutes before this building stops being a hostage situation and becomes a demolition site." The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone understanding something they really did not want to understand. Then, from somewhere above them, from the infrastructure of the ceiling, from a point Mara estimated was 6 feet to the left of the air return vent she'd been tracking in her peripheral vision for the last 20 minutes, came a sound that was not the HVAC. The lead man looked up. The lean man looked up. Mara did not look up because she already knew what was up there, and because she was watching the door to the bay corridor, where one of the remaining gunmen had just stepped out with his hand pressed to his earpiece and an expression on his face that Mara had seen before on men who had just received information that required immediate escalation. "Boss," the man said. "What?" "The patient. Bay 3. A pause. A terrible, clarifying pause. "He's gone," the man said. "Dalton's gone." The lead man spun. "Gone how? Dead?" Gone. "The bay's empty. The window's broken. Someone came in from outside and they took him out through the wall." For 3 full seconds, the lead man stood in the center of the waiting room of Harrow General Hospital, and the sound of his operation falling apart was almost audible. The particular silence of someone who has just watched the thing they came for disappear through a third-floor window while they were managing the wrong problem. Then he turned and looked at Mara with eyes that were past calculation and into something raw. "Did you know?" he said. She said the truth because it was also the most useful thing she could say. "No, but I'm not surprised." He grabbed her arm. Not rough, but firm. The grip of someone who has decided she is now the most important variable in a situation that has just lost its primary objective. "You said 3 devices. Show me." She looked at his hand on her arm, then at him. "All right," she said. And she stood up, and she walked toward the supply corridor, and the lead man walked with her, and neither of them noticed, or rather, only one of them noticed, that the gray-haired man's angle through the ceiling had shifted in the last 4 minutes, and that the new position put him directly above the nurse's station, directly above the intercom panel, directly above the one piece of hospital infrastructure that could reach every room, every floor, every corridor in the building simultaneously. Mara noticed. She kept walking. The supply corridor smelled like disinfectant and old ductwork, the particular institutional odor that Mara had stopped noticing after her first month at Harrow General, and now noticed again because she was noticing everything. She walked 3 paces ahead of the lead man, and she walked without hesitation, because hesitation created questions, and questions cost time, and she had already calculated that she had less time than she wanted. The wire at the base of the corridor door was exactly where she'd left it in her memory. Thin, color-matched, running left to right along the baseboard before disappearing behind the utility housing. She stopped 2 feet from it and crouched down without touching anything. "There," she said. The lead man crouched beside her. She felt him register the wire. The small shift of his breathing, the controlled stillness that was itself a kind of reaction. "I need light," she said. He pulled a small tactical light from his vest and angled it along the baseboard. The beam caught the wire clearly, followed it right to where it met a junction box behind the housing, a small gray rectangle that was not standard hospital infrastructure and had been attached to the wall with adhesive rather than mounting hardware. "Pressure trigger or signal-based?" he asked. The question landed differently than she expected. He knew what he was looking at. "Signal-based," she said. "The timing I heard earlier was cycling through multiple nodes. Pressure triggers don't cycle." He was quiet for a moment. "You heard the cycling. Through the floor in the waiting area. Irregular interval, not mechanical. It's checking connectivity. He stood up slowly. She stood with him. In the tight space of the corridor with the tactical light still on and the wire visible at their feet, the specific fiction that had been operating between them, that he was in control of this situation and she was a nurse he was managing, became untenable. "How many do you think there are?" he said. "Minimum 6 to do this building properly, could be more." "And you found 3. "I found evidence of 3 positions. I don't know if each position has one device or multiple." He looked at the junction box for a moment longer. "Who taught you to read a network like this?" She didn't answer. He didn't push. He was past pushing on that question, she could see. Past it, because the answer didn't change the situation, and the situation required his full attention. "The intercom," he said suddenly. "Back in the waiting room. Someone's in the ceiling above it." She had been waiting to see if he'd get there on his own. "Yes," she said. "Your people." "Most likely." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and had no humor in it. "So, while I was managing you, someone was positioning above our heads." "While you were managing the room," she said, which was not quite the same thing, but she let him hear whichever version he needed. He clicked the tactical light off. In the sudden dimness of the corridor, lit only by the emergency strips along the baseboard, which were a different kind of irony, she could see him working through the decision architecture of a man whose operation had inverted itself. He had come into Harrow General to retrieve something from a patient. The patient was gone. The building was wired by a party he hadn't known existed. His communications were compromised enough that the opposing team had his operational number. And the most useful person in the building, currently standing 2 feet away from him in a supply corridor, worked for someone else. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I know I don't have a lot of cards left to play. Okay? What happens if I put my team down? Weapons on the floor, hands up, walk out?" She looked at him. "Your team goes to federal holding. You face charges for the hostage situation regardless of outcome. Whatever you came here for goes with Dalton." "And the building?" "The building problem doesn't go away because you cooperate. The network is already armed. If the person running it decides to trigger it, they trigger it. But if you find the devices, if I find the devices, maybe. Maybe not. I don't know the trigger mechanism, and I don't have the right tools, and this is not a controlled environment." She said it flatly because he needed the flat version. "What I know how to do is find them. What happens after that depends on factors I don't fully control." He processed this. She watched his face in the dim corridor light and saw something that she hadn't seen in him before. Not surrender, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has recognized that he is not going to come out of this with anything he came in for, and is now trying to determine the minimum acceptable loss. "The hostages," he said. "What about them? If I release them, then you've reduced the charge exposure significantly and you've removed the civilian liability from the building problem." She paused. "And I'd be able to move without managing around them." He looked at her for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. "You've been thinking about this the whole time." "Yes, from the moment we walked in." "From about 30 seconds before you walked in," she said. He made the sound again that wasn't a laugh. Then he looked at the wire one more time, looked at the corridor ceiling, and said, "Tell me what you need." What followed was not clean. It was not a controlled handover or a negotiated arrangement with clear terms. It was 2 people with completely opposed objectives, finding the narrow band of overlap where their interests aligned, and operating in that band under time pressure, in a damaged building, with a third party somewhere above their heads, whose intentions Mara understood only in general terms. The lead man, who told her his name was Reeves, which she believed about 60%, spoke to his team through the radio for 4 minutes, while Mara stood in the corridor and waited. She heard his voice change register during the call in a way that told her it wasn't an easy conversation. Ty, at minimum, pushed back. She heard Reeves say the operation is compromised at the source level, and she heard him say, "I'm making a call," and she heard a silence on the radio that stretched long enough to be the specific silence of someone deciding whether to accept a decision or escalate it. Then Ty's voice. "Copy." Reeves came back to her. "We'll move the hostages to the ambulance bay. Police take them from there. My team stays inside until..." "Until what?" He looked at her. until we see how this ends. She understood that. His team didn't have a clean exit. Walking out with the hostages was walking straight into federal arrest. Whatever calculus he was running, it involved staying inside the building until there was something he could offer in exchange for a different outcome. She wasn't going to manage that problem for him right now. "I need to move through the building freely," she said. "Ty goes with you." "Ty doesn't go with me. Ty is visible and armed, and every staff member in this building is going to react to him in ways that cost time." "I'm not letting you shag." "You don't have a choice," she said, and she said it without heat, just as a statement of current arithmetic. "You need me to find those devices. I need to move fast. Send Ty to help manage the ambulance bay transition, and let me do what I'm telling you I can do." A beat. "You're going to run." "I'm going to do exactly what I said I'm going to do." She held his gaze. "If I run, the building goes up and your team is inside it. I have the same interest in this outcome that you do." He held the gaze for another moment. Then he stepped back. She went. Mara moved through Harrow General the way she had once moved through buildings in other countries, with the specific economy of someone who has calibrated speed and visibility against each other and found the right ratio. Not running, because running attracted attention, and attention cost her the access she needed, fast enough that she covered ground. Eyes everywhere. The second device location she'd identified was the utility panel on the north wall of the ER. She went there first because it was close and because she wanted to confirm what she suspected about the scope. The panel was a standard hospital electrical access point, gray metal housing, keyed lock that had been bypassed with a small magnetic shim that the facilities team wouldn't have noticed unless they were specifically looking for it. Inside the panel, behind the main breaker array, someone had mounted a secondary housing that was not electrical. Black composite casing, approximately the size of a hardback book. A single green LED was lit on its face, which meant active. She didn't touch it. Touching without knowing the trigger parameters was how people got killed. She took the 30-second observation she needed: casing type, indicator configuration, wire routing, antenna stub on the upper right corner that confirmed signal-based activation, and moved. The third location, behind the nurse's station, was the one that worried her most because of the intercom panel directly above it. If the gray-haired man had come through the ceiling for the intercom, and she was increasingly certain he had, then he was positioned within 4 feet of an armed device, and she needed to know whether he knew that. She reached the nurse's station from the side corridor, coming at it from the supply room angle rather than the open floor. The station was empty. Staff had been moved with the hostages, and the intercom panel on the wall above the desk was a standard hospital model, main speaker and zone selector, the kind of system you use to reach every room in the building simultaneously. She stood at the desk and looked at the ceiling. "You need to shift left," she said, at normal conversational volume. A pause. Then, from above the ceiling tile directly overhead, "How'd you clock me?" She hadn't heard the gray-haired man's voice in 3 years, and it sounded exactly the same. "Petra saw you, 7 years old." A slight sound of movement. "Better?" 2 more feet. There's a device in the wall to your right, behind the intercom housing. Don't put any weight on that side. The movement stopped immediately. "Confirmed?" "Active, green indicator, signal trigger." "Understood." His voice was coming from a different position now, the left shifted one. "You found 3. Working on the count. How are you in there?" "Cramped. These vents were not designed for someone my age." A pause. "We have an asset outside who can handle the devices if you can get him access and coordinates." "How long do you need to set up on the intercom?" 30 seconds once I'm in position. I'm waiting on your clear." She thought through the layout. The ambulance bay was the most defensible exit point once the hostages were moved. If she could identify the remaining devices before Reeves lost patience, or before whoever controlled the network decided the window had closed. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "You have 8, the gray-haired man said. "There's been radio traffic on a frequency we're monitoring. Someone outside the building is waiting for a confirmation signal from inside. When they don't get it in the next 8 minutes, they move to manual." She processed that. Manual trigger meant someone with a physical detonator, not network-based, which meant her device count was irrelevant to the backup plan. "Who's the outside man?" she said. "We don't have a full ID. We have a vehicle and a frequency and a name that might be a cover." "What's the name?" A pause that was not hesitation, but something more considered. "Voss." She stood at the nurse's station in the empty ER, and the name went through her like cold water. "Say that again," she said. "Voss. The name on the frequency registration. It's probably a cover. The registration is layered through 3 shells. But whoever built it wanted us to find it, or didn't care if we did." Mara's badge was on her chest. Mara Voss, RN. She had taken the name 4 years ago. Simple administrative fiction, a new identity, a new history, a nursing license under a name that no active file connected to her prior service, clean and untraceable, or it had been. The name Voss was not her name. It was a name she had chosen from a list of available identities after her exit processing, and she had chosen it without particular significance. Someone had known to use it, someone had used it specifically, which meant someone knew who she was, knew where she was working, and had named the operation, or the operator, after her cover identity. "The outside man," she said. "Is he running the devices or running the whole thing?" "We think the whole thing. The hostage team is a separate contract. He brought them in as a distraction and to force the patient transfer, but the building is his operation." "Why this building?" she said, though she was already running the answer before the question was out. Dalton was carrying documentation of an illegal procurement network, military hardware, diverted through 3 private contractors, with sign-off that goes up high enough to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Dalton was scheduled to hand it to a federal contact in Caldwell tomorrow morning. So burning the building was the backup plan. Kill Dalton, destroy any copies he'd stored here. "And frame a hostage situation as the cause," the gray-haired man said. "Clean. Lots of confusion, lots of chaos. Fire investigation takes months." Except Dalton got out. Which means the outside man has no reason to abort. Burning the building still destroys whatever documentation Dalton left and eliminates any witnesses who could testify to the separate operation. Mara stood very still for a moment. "The hostages," she said. "Yes. Reeves is moving them to the ambulance bay." "I know. It's the right call, but it doesn't help us. The ambulance bay is inside the building's footprint." She was already moving before he finished the sentence. The ambulance bay was on the south side of the building, and she came into it from the internal access corridor, pushing through the double doors to find exactly what she'd expected. Reeves's team running the transfer. Ty directing people through the bay with the rifles still visible but angled down. And approximately 30 civilians moving in the compressed, hunched way of people trying to cover distance while staying low. Petra was near the back of the group, holding Sandra's hand and the rabbit simultaneously. Mara found Reeves at the bay entrance. "Stop the transfer," she said. He turned. "We're halfway through. Ambulance bay is inside the blast radius. I need 5 minutes to calculate, and I need your team to hold here." He looked at her, then at the civilians, then at the doors to the ambulance bay exterior where the police cordon was visible through the gap. "If I stop this and the police see us stopping, radio out and tell them there's a device near the exterior doors. That's not a lie. There may be." She didn't actually know, but the possibility was real enough. 5 minutes. He held for a moment that felt longer than it was. 4, he said. "I'm giving you 4. She went back into the building. The south utility corridor, the east maintenance junction. She moved through both in under 2 minutes, looking for the installation signature she'd learned from the first 3. Adhesive mounting, off-brand composite casing, green LED, antenna stub. The south corridor was clean. The east junction had a device behind the junction box that was larger than the others and had 2 LEDs, one green and one amber. Amber meant something the others hadn't indicated. She stared at the amber LED for 3 seconds. Amber on a signal-based system was a secondary trigger indicator. The device was online and receiving, but the amber meant it had a second activation pathway. Not just the network, but a direct line to a physical detonator. This was the primary. The others were supports. She had found it. She got back on her feet and moved toward the stairwell, because the fastest route back to the intercom position ran through the second-floor corridor, and because she had just understood something that changed the available time from 4 minutes to considerably less. The amber LED had been blinking. Not constant, blinking. Which meant the device had received a partial signal. Not a trigger, not yet, but contact. Someone outside was testing the connection. She took the stairs 2 at a time, and she was not thinking about tactics anymore. She was thinking about the name Voss and the amber LED and the gray-haired man in the ceiling and the 8-minute window that had started before this conversation and was now, she calculated, at approximately 4 minutes remaining. She came out of the stairwell onto the second-floor corridor, and she was running now, not caring about visibility because there was no one on this floor. The staff had been consolidated downstairs, and the sound of her footsteps on the linoleum was the only sound on the entire second floor of Harrow General. She reached the nurses' station access point from above, the ceiling grid access panel in the second-floor utility corridor that would connect to the space above the first-floor nurses' station. "I have the primary," she said to the ceiling. "Location," the gray-haired man said, from much closer than she'd expected. She gave him the coordinates in the format she'd been trained to use: building axis, corridor designation, junction distance, and heard him relay it in the same format to someone outside. 2 minutes to get someone to that position, he said. "I don't have 2 minutes. "Mara, get on the intercom," she said. "Now, whatever you're going to say it. I need everyone who can move to move. We don't have the building cleared. We're not going to get it cleared. Get on the intercom." A pause that she felt in her chest. Then, above her, the sound of a ceiling tile shifting, and then the intercom panel in the nurse's station below her crackled to life, and the gray-haired man's voice, steady, unhurried, the voice of someone who had given orders in difficult rooms for a long time, came through every speaker on every floor of Harrow General simultaneously. "Attention all personnel. Federal Authorization Code 7. All staff and civilians proceed immediately to the south parking structure via the exterior walkway. This is not a drill. Proceed now." For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then, below her, she heard the sound of 30 people beginning to move. And simultaneously, from somewhere in the external structure of the building, from a position she hadn't identified and couldn't reach, a different sound started. Not a timer, not a cycle, a tone. Constant, high-pitched, the kind of tone a device makes when it has received a full activation signal and has begun its terminal countdown. Mara was already at the stairwell door. In the east junction, 40 feet of corridor and 1 floor below her, the primary device's amber LED had almost certainly turned red. And the person holding the physical detonator, the outside man, the one using her name, the one who had planned all of this with the patience and access of someone who had been inside this operation for a long time, had just decided that his 8 minutes were up. She took the stairs without thinking about her knees. The East Junction corridor was below her and 40 feet south, and she covered the distance in the time it took her to stop calculating and start moving, which was not the same as not thinking. She was thinking the whole way down, running the variables with the part of her brain that had been trained to run them while the rest of her was doing something else entirely. The tone she'd heard was a pre-detonation signal, not the detonation itself. That distinction mattered. A pre-detonation signal meant there was a delay built into the system, a window between the trigger command and the actual event, long enough for the person holding the detonator to be clear of the blast radius. Standard practice for anyone who wanted to survive their own operation. The question was whether that window was 30 seconds or 3 minutes, and she didn't know. And not knowing was the most dangerous part of the next 60 seconds of her life. She hit the East Junction corridor at full speed and pulled up 3 feet from the junction box. The device casing was unchanged from her observation 2 minutes ago. Same black composite, same mounting. The LEDs had changed. Green was still lit, amber was still lit, and there was now a third indicator she hadn't seen before, a small red light in the lower left corner of the casing that blinked on a 1-second interval. 1-second interval meant the countdown was in the range of 1 to 3 minutes. Faster blinking meant less time. She'd learned that in a training environment, and she had never wanted to verify it in the field, and here she was verifying it. She did not touch the casing. What she did was look at the wire routing, where the signal wire ran from the antenna stub into the casing, and where the power wire came in from the building electrical junction behind the box. Power was the variable. Signal-based systems needed power to receive and execute. Cut the power to the device specifically, and the signal had nowhere to go. The problem was that cutting power to the East Junction box cut power to the entire East Corridor, including the emergency lighting, including 2 patient room circuits on the floor above, and she was in a building with patients who were supposed to be evacuating. The other problem was that she didn't have wire cutters. She stood in the corridor for 1 second. One of the red LEDs blinks. And then she went to the maintenance cabinet 6 feet to her left, the gray metal utility cabinet that every hospital corridor in every hospital she'd ever been in had in roughly the same position, and she pulled it open. Electrical tape, spare fuses, a voltmeter, work gloves, a pair of lineman's pliers. Close enough. She pulled the gloves on, took the pliers, went back to the junction box, opened the electrical panel behind it, and found the circuit breaker for the East Junction in 4 seconds because hospital electrical panels were always labeled by zone, and she had read this hospital's zone map during her first month of employment because she had read every layout document she could access during her first month of employment because that was the kind of person she was. She tripped the breaker. The corridor lights went out. Emergency strips along the floor activated immediately, red-tinted, enough to see by. She looked at the device. The amber LED went dark. The green LED went dark. The red LED blinked once more, then went dark. She stood in the dim corridor and listened to the building and breathed. Then she got back on her feet and moved toward the ambulance bay because tripping one breaker in one corridor did not solve the network, and she needed the gray-haired man to know what she'd done, and she needed to know if the outside asset had reached the primary. She was halfway down the south corridor when the building shook. Not catastrophically, not the shockwave of a structural detonation, a smaller concussion, sharp, localized, somewhere in the north end of the building, followed by the distinctive pressure change of a device that had gone off in a contained space. She stopped, put her hand on the wall. The wall was intact. The floor was intact. The emergency lighting was still running. Whatever had gone off, it had gone off in a space that wasn't load-bearing, which meant either the device was smaller than she'd estimated, or the location was peripheral to the main structure. Her radio. She didn't have one. She needed a radio. Reeves was in the ambulance bay with his remaining team, and the civilians were still there, held at the interior edge of the bay in a group that was no longer neatly organized. The intercom announcement had done something to the room's equilibrium. People were moving, pressing toward the exterior doors, and Ty was holding the line with the practiced joylessness of someone who had been handed a task he didn't design and didn't like. Reeves saw her come through the doors, and his face did something complicated. "What was that?" he said. "North end. Secondary device. Contained space. What's your radio situation?" He handed her the unit from his vest without being asked, which told her something about how far the power dynamic had shifted in the last 20 minutes. She keyed the radio. "This is Mara. I need a status on the primary." Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize, but younger, clipped, professional. "Mara, this is Ket. Primary is neutralized. We reached it 40 seconds before terminal. The countdown was 90 seconds from signal." 90 seconds. She had had 90 seconds from when she'd heard the tone to when the primary would have fired. She had used roughly 60 of them getting to the East Junction and disabling the secondary. She had had 30 seconds to spare. She did not think about that in the way it wanted to be thought about, because thinking about it that way didn't help anything right now. "The north end device fired," she said into the radio. A pause. "Confirmed. It was isolated. Network junction room, north utility corridor, no structural contact. Contained fire, suppression system activated. Building integrity is intact." "How many remain active?" "We count 2 additional network nodes. Both are now signal dark. Your East Junction breaker cut their power feed. Without the primary relay, they can't receive a trigger command." She lowered the radio. Reeves was watching her. Behind him, the civilians were pressing harder against the exterior doors, and Ty had stopped pretending he could hold them. "Let them out," she told Reeves. He looked at her, then at his team, then at the exterior doors where the red and blue light of the police cordon was visible through the gap. "If I open those doors—" "Your team is inside a building that just had a device go off," she said. "Whatever leverage the situation gave you is gone. Let them out." He stood for a moment that cost him something. She could see it costing him, the specific expenditure of a decision that doesn't have a good option on either side. Then he looked at Ty and gave a short nod. Ty pushed the exterior bay doors open. The cold night air came in hard, and with it the sound of the police cordon erupting into motion, and the civilians moved through the gap in a compressed, urgent stream. Sandra pulling Petra by the hand, the rabbit still clutched against the girl's chest. Petra looking back once over her shoulder at Mara with an expression that was too complicated for a 7-year-old and exactly right for a person who had just come through something they would carry for a long time. Mara watched them go. Then she turned back to Reeves, who had not moved toward the door. "Your people can walk out," she said. "Right now, that's the best outcome available." He looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do?" "Find the man with the detonator." She found the gray-haired man at the nurse's station. He had come down from the ceiling through the access panel in a way that had left a ceiling tile cracked, and both his trouser knees marked with insulation dust, and he was sitting on the edge of the desk with his phone to his ear when she came through the corridor. He held up a finger, 1 moment, and finished the call, and when he lowered the phone he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has spent 30 years calibrating how much to show on his face and is currently choosing to show more than usual. "Mara," he said. "Colonel," she said, because that was what he'd been the last time she'd worked with him, and she didn't know what he was now, and Colonel covered the distance adequately. His name was Warren Gale, and he was 61 years old, and he had been the commanding officer of her unit for the last 2 years of her service, and she had not spoken to him since her exit processing when he had shaken her hand in a conference room and said, "You did good work," in the tone of someone who meant it and knew it wasn't enough. "The outside man," she said. "What do you have?" Vehicle was a gray panel van, south parking structure, 3rd level. It left approximately 4 minutes ago. We have traffic camera coverage on the exit route, but he had a 45-second head start on our pursuit unit. He triggered manually. Yes. We believe he saw the civilian evacuation and determined the window was closing. The north device was the one he had direct line of sight to trigger from the south structure. She thought about that. A man in a parking structure 3 levels up, watching the ambulance bay doors open through binoculars or a scope, making the call to trigger the one device he could reach manually before the situation fully inverted on him. "He's not panicking," she said. "No. A panicking man triggers everything and runs. He triggered one and ran. He's cutting losses." Gale nodded. "Which means he has another play." She looked at the intercom panel above the nurse's station desk. Gale had used it, and it had done what it needed to do, but there was something sitting at the edge of her thinking about the name Voss and the specific patience required to wire a building and orchestrate 2 separate operational teams and plan a backup trigger for a backup trigger. "The name on the frequency," she said. "Voss. How long has that been there?" Gale's expression shifted slightly. "The registration traces back 14 months. 14 months. She had been at Harrow General for 3 years. 14 months ago, she had been here, working, visible, her name on her badge every shift. "He's been watching me," she said. Not a question. "We think you were incidental to the location selection," Gale said carefully. "Dalton was scheduled to be transported through Caldwell. Harrow General was selected because it was the most viable target in the transport corridor. Your presence here was a coincidence that he found useful," she said, "or a coincidence that he found amusing. We don't know enough about him yet to know which." She stood at the nurse's station in the empty emergency room, and she thought about a man who had spent 14 months building an operation, who had used her name as a call sign, who had wired a hospital with the patience of someone who was very sure of his timeline. "He didn't expect the operation to fall apart this fast," she said. "No. Which means he has contingencies, but he built them for a longer window. Whatever his next move is, it wasn't supposed to happen tonight." Gale looked at her. "That's our read as well." "So what does he do with an accelerated timeline and a failed primary objective?" The question sat in the air for a moment. Then Gale's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and when he lowered the phone, his face had the look of someone receiving confirmation of something they had hoped would not be confirmed. "They found the van," he said. "South parking structure, level 3. Abandoned. The driver transferred to a second vehicle. Plates on the second vehicle? Stolen. Transferred approximately 6 minutes ago. He paused. Mara. The second vehicle is a Harrow General Facilities van. White, hospital logo on the side. She understood immediately. A man in a hospital facilities van could go anywhere in the building's external infrastructure without attracting attention. Could park at a service entrance, walk through a maintenance corridor, access systems that weren't on the main floor plans. Could, if he knew the building well enough, and after 14 months of watching, he knew it well enough, reach the utility infrastructure without going through any of the entry points that were currently covered. She was moving before Gail finished the sentence. The hospital's utility infrastructure ran below grade. This was standard for hospitals of Harrow General's era, built in the late 1980s, when the thinking was to keep mechanical systems accessible without routing maintenance personnel through patient areas. The basement level housed HVAC, the main electrical switchgear, the emergency generator system, the medical gas manifolds, and the data infrastructure that ran every networked system in the building. She took the service elevator to the basement because the stairwell required a keycard she didn't have, and the elevator only required holding the door close button and the basement button simultaneously, which was a maintenance bypass she'd learned from a facilities technician named Roy during a slow night shift 18 months ago. Roy had told her that trick because she'd asked him how his week was going and listened to the answer, and the answer had taken 45 minutes and covered 3 topics unrelated to hospital maintenance. And at the end of it, he'd shown her the elevator trick because it seemed like the natural conclusion of a conversation that had been going well. She thought about Roy briefly as the elevator descended and hoped he'd gotten out through the ambulance bay. The basement was dim and loud. The HVAC systems were running at full capacity because nobody had shut them down, and the noise was the deep industrial hum of a building still trying to function normally while the floors above it had been a hostage crisis for the past 2 hours. Emergency lighting was active down here too, the same red-tinted strips as the upper corridors, giving everything the quality of a space that was awake but not quite right. She moved fast along the main utility corridor, reading the overhead signage. Electrical main, Gen 1, HV, AC Zone A, data infrastructure, and listening past the HVAC noise for anything that didn't belong to it. She heard him before she saw him. Not the sound of movement, the sound of a keyboard. A small, deliberate click, click, click of someone typing commands into a terminal, which was a sound that shouldn't have been happening in the hospital's data infrastructure room at 2 in the morning. The data infrastructure room was the third door on the left, and its door was open. She stopped outside it, breathed. In her mind, she ran what she had. No weapon, no radio. She'd left it with Gail, which in retrospect was a choice she'd made because she hadn't expected to be here, which was the kind of imperfection that happened when you were operating outside a planned framework in a building that had been mostly exploded at. The man inside the room was armed. She had to assume that. He had a detonator at minimum, possibly more. What she had was the element of surprise and the specific advantage of knowing what someone who underestimates a nurse looks like when they stop paying attention to one. She went in fast and low. The man at the terminal was not what she'd expected. He was perhaps 55, slight-framed, with the kind of forgettable face that was almost certainly cultivated, nothing distinctive enough to anchor in a witness's memory. He was dressed in a Harrow General Facilities uniform, the white coverall with the hospital logo on the chest, and he was seated at the terminal with both hands on a keyboard and a phone face up on the desk to his right. He heard her come in, and he moved well, faster than his frame suggested, spinning off the chair and putting the desk between them in one motion. His right hand went to his waist and came up with a compact pistol that he pointed at her with the calm of someone who had done this before. They were 6 feet apart. "Stop," he said. She stopped. He looked at her. His eyes moved to her badge, the reflex of someone cataloging information even in a high-stress moment, and she watched his face when he read the name. Mara Voss, RN. Something crossed his expression. Not surprise, closer to the look of someone encountering an expected variable at an unexpected moment. "You're the nurse," he said, "and you're the man who used my name." He looked at her for a moment. "That wasn't personal." "I know." She kept her hands visible, her posture open, her weight on her back foot. "What were you doing at the terminal?" "Nothing that concerns you now. The devices are neutralized," she said. "The primary is gone. Your van was found. Whatever you're doing at that terminal is a contingency for a plan that's already over." He tilted his head slightly. "You're very informed for a nurse." "I'm informed because I've been paying attention for the last 2 hours." He studied her with the unhurried quality of someone who believes they have time to study things, which told her he didn't yet fully understand how much had changed upstairs. "The terminal," she said. "What does it connect to?" He didn't answer. She looked at the screen behind him. The terminal was displaying a command interface. Dark background, white text, and the last command entered was still visible. She read it in the peripheral view she had past his shoulder, reading it the way she'd been trained to read things she wasn't supposed to be looking at directly. It was a data wipe command, targeted at the hospital's network infrastructure, not the patient records, not the clinical systems. The administrative network, the system that stored security footage, access logs, personnel records, visitor registration. He was erasing the building's record of who had been inside it tonight, including his own access, including whatever records might show how long his people had had access to this building, how the devices had been installed, who had badged in and out during the installation period. "Stop the wipe," she said. "It's already running." She looked at the progress bar at the bottom of the screen. 11%. "How long does it run?" He almost smiled. "Long enough." She moved, not toward him, toward the terminal, which was the wrong move tactically and the right move for everything else, because the wipe completing mattered more in the long run than the gun 6 feet away, and she had calculated his response time and his angle and the distance between them and the desk, and she had 2 seconds before he could reach her and adjust aim around the terminal housing. She hit the terminal's power switch with the heel of her hand. The screen went dark. He hit her, not with the gun, with his forearm, catching her across the shoulder and spinning her into the desk, and she hit the edge hard enough to feel it in her ribs and grabbed the desk to keep from going down. He was faster than he looked and stronger than he looked, and the gun came up to her temple and the room went very still. "That was stupid," he said. Her shoulder was ringing, her ribs were ringing louder. "The footage is already on an external server," she said, which was a guess but an educated one. Gail's team would have pulled external security feeds the moment they arrived. "The wipe doesn't matter." The gun stayed at her temple. "Maybe not, but I still have options." "What options?" "I walk out of here with you in front of me." She thought about that. A man with a gun and a hostage, moving through a building that now had federal assets on every floor. The specific calculation of how many people would let a man with a gun walk rather than risk the person in front of it. She had been that calculus twice in her life. Once in the field, once tonight in the waiting room upstairs, when she had put herself between the lead man and Petra. The difference was that she was not Petra. "You're not going to walk out of this building," she said. "Move," he said. "I'm not going to do that either." The gun pressed harder. "You think I won't?" "I think you're a man who has spent 14 months building a careful operation and is now improvising in a basement at 2 a.m, and improvisation is not your strong suit." She kept her voice flat. "I think you triggered one device when you should have held, and you ran from your vehicle when you should have stayed mobile, and you came into this building when you should have been 20 miles away. You're making bad decisions because the situation is moving faster than your contingencies." A pause. "And the gun at my head," she said, "is another bad decision. Because the people upstairs know I'm down here, and a shot in a concrete room is loud enough to hear on every floor." "Then I don't shoot," he said. "I walk you out." "You can try," she said. And then, from the corridor outside the data infrastructure room, the sound of footsteps. More than one set. Moving with the clipped, deliberate rhythm of people who know exactly where they're going. The man's gun hand shifted. Fractional, involuntary, the small adjustment of someone whose attention has divided between two threats. And Mara moved. She dropped her weight and drove her elbow back and up into the space where his gun arm was, catching his wrist with the inside of her elbow and redirecting rather than blocking, turning into him rather than away. And the gun fired once into the ceiling as his grip broke, and then she had his wrist in both hands, and she leveraged it against the joint in the way that ends that particular problem quickly and without complexity. He went down. She stepped back. Her ribs were loud now. Her shoulder was louder. The gun was on the floor, and she kicked it under the desk because putting herself between him and a weapon again was not a position she wanted to revisit. Gale came through the door first, with two people behind him she didn't recognize. Young, tactical vests, federal insignia. And he took in the room in one sweep, the man on the floor, the dark terminal, Mara standing with her hand pressed to her ribs. He tried to wipe the administrative network, she said. I killed the terminal at 11%. Whatever the external team pulled should be sufficient. Gale looked at the man on the floor. The man was sitting up now, holding his wrist, and his face had completed whatever transition it had been making since she'd come into the room. He looked tired. Not defeated? Not yet. But the specific tiredness of someone whose options have reduced to a number too small to work with. Marcus Ellery, Gale said. We've been looking for you for about 4 years. The man on the floor, Ellery, looked up at Gale, then at Mara, then back at Gale. You brought her in specifically, he said. You knew she was in this hospital. We knew she was in this city, Gale said. We didn't know she was in this specific building until about 90 minutes ago. Ellery looked at Mara again. And when you found out? We accelerated, Gale said simply. The two federal agents moved to either side of Ellery, and the handcuffing was efficient and unremarkable. The mechanics of an arrest that had been a long time coming. Ellery didn't resist. He watched it happen with the remote quality of someone observing an event they have accepted as inevitable. Then he looked at Mara one more time. The name, he said. Voss. I chose it because it was clean, no significance. She looked at him. I know. You might have a problem with that. The people looking at this case are going to see your name all over a 14-month operational record. That's going to take some explaining. I'll manage, she said. You're very calm about it. She pressed her hand against her ribs and breathed carefully. I'm a nurse. We're calm about things. The next 3 hours happened in segments that she remembered later as distinct blocks, the way traumatic timelines always fractured into discrete units that resisted being assembled into a continuous narrative. The federal team processed the building room by room. The two remaining network nodes were physically removed by an explosives technician who worked with the unhurried precision of someone who had neutralized worse, which was either reassuring or not depending on your frame of reference. The north utility room where the one device had fired was cordoned and assessed. Concrete construction had contained the blast to the room itself, and the suppression system had handled the fire in under 2 minutes. Structural damage was limited to one wall and the ceiling, neither load-bearing. Reeves and his team came out of the building through the ambulance bay at 2:47 in the morning, weapons on the floor, hands up, walking into the cordon in a line that had more dignity to it than the situation probably warranted. Ty was the last one out. He walked with the particular bearing of someone who has decided that how you carry a loss matters, which Mara could respect even in the context of everything else. She gave her initial debrief to a federal agent named Solis, mid-40s, sharp, with the kind of note-taking that suggested she was getting it exactly right the first time, while sitting in the back of an ambulance in the parking lot. The ribs turned out to be bruised, not broken, which was the kind of news that felt better than it was, because bruised ribs were still extremely unpleasant. You killed the terminal at 11%, Solis said. Yes. That means 89% of the administrative records are intact. That was the intention. Solis wrote something. The footage from the installation periods. If it's in there, it corroborates the timeline for the device placement, the identity of anyone who accessed the building during that period, the whole chain. Yes. Solis looked up from her notes. Ms. Voss, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Your prior service, the classification on your file. We're going to need to access portions of that record for this case. Mara had expected this, had been running the expectation through her head since Gale had said we've been looking for him for 4 years. Because 4 years meant Ellery had been operational for at least that long, and tracking his network was going to require a full picture of every asset and operation that intersected with him. She intersected with him now, which meant she was part of that picture. I understand, she said. It's not optional. I know it's not optional. Solis held her gaze for a moment. There's going to be a period while this investigation runs where your situation here is complicated. The media is going to find out that a nurse with a classified military background neutralized devices in this building tonight. That's not a story that stays contained. No, Mara agreed. How do you want to handle it? Mara sat in the back of the ambulance with the parking lot chaos visible behind Solis. Lights everywhere, vehicles, personnel, the organized disruption of a scene in active processing. And she thought about the question. She thought about Petra, who had seen the man in the ceiling and had told Mara quietly, in a room full of armed men, because she decided that Mara was the right person to tell. She thought about Dr. Pell, who had intubated a patient under gunpoint and held her fury with both hands so it didn't cost the situation anything. She thought about Donna Haverford, her charge nurse, who had described her calmness as either a gift or a problem. She thought about 3 years of medication runs and patient names and charting done on time, and the small, specific satisfaction of work that helped people live. Honestly, she said. Solis wrote that down too. At 4:15 in the morning, the building was cleared for limited access, and Mara walked back into Harrow General through the ambulance bay. She wasn't sure why. She had given her debrief. There was no clinical reason for her to be inside. But she walked through the bay doors and into the south corridor, and the smell of the building was exactly what it had been 12 hours ago. Disinfectant, HVAC. The ambient smell of a place where sick people and well people moved through the same air. And it was so precisely normal that she stood in the corridor for a moment and just breathed. Gale found her there. He had the look of a man who had been managing a major operation for the past 6 hours, and was running on the specific fuel of someone who had chosen not to acknowledge fatigue until the work was done. "Ellery's in federal custody," he said. "Van Cove Field Office." Did he talk? Not yet, but the documentation Dalton was carrying, we have it. He's stable, by the way. The extraction team had a medic with them. She nodded. The documentation names 8 individuals involved in the procurement network, Gale said. 3 of them are currently in positions that explain the classification level of what we've been running. That's why Ellery needed the building to go up. Yes. Without the documentation and without Dalton's testimony, the case was circumstantial. With both, he paused. It becomes something else entirely. She stood in the corridor and thought about a man who had spent 14 months planning a careful operation, who had used her name for a call sign, who had come very close to burning this building down with 30 people inside it, so that 8 names on a document would stay protected. He's going to try to make a deal, she said. He's going to try. The documentation makes deals complicated. She looked at the corridor, the familiar linoleum, the overnight emergency lighting still running because nobody had gotten around to switching the building back to standard illumination yet. What about Reeves? Cooperating, Gale said. His team was a contract hire. They were told they were extracting a witness in a compromised protection situation. They didn't know about the devices. Do you believe that? The debrief is ongoing. A pause. Provisionally? She accepted that. Mara. He said her name the way he had in the ceiling, with the particular weight of someone who is about to say something they've been holding for a while. This is going to get complicated for you. The case, the records, the exposure. I want you to know that we're going to manage the classified aspects as carefully as we can, but some things are going to come out, she said. Yes, and Harrow General is going to know their nurse had a classified military background and spent tonight neutralizing explosive devices in their basement. They're going to know, he said. She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling tile above the nurse's station was still cracked from where Gale had come through it. She could see the gap from here. There's a charge nurse on this floor, she said. Donna Haverford. She's been doing this for 22 years. She's going to have a lot of questions. She will, Gale agreed. I'd like to talk to her before the official statements go out, if that's possible. I'll see what I can arrange. She pushed off the wall. Her ribs registered the movement in the specific way that bruised ribs registered everything for the next 6 to 8 weeks, which was a timeline she was already resigning herself to managing. The name, she said. Voss. Is it... She paused. Is it compromised now? Gail was quiet for a moment. Yes. She had expected that too. The name had been operational cover, and it had served its purpose, and now it had been attached to a federal case and a 14-month intelligence record and a news story that Solis had correctly identified as impossible to contain. Voss was going to mean something specific in certain circles for a long time, and what it meant was going to follow it everywhere. "I'll need to think about that," she said. "Take the time you need." He paused. "For what it's worth, and I know this is not the context in which you wanted to hear it, what you did tonight was exactly what we would have hoped for, and significantly more than we had any right to expect." She looked at him. "You had me placed here." "We knew you were here. We didn't place you." He met her gaze steadily. "The choice you made 3 years ago was yours. Tonight was yours too." She held that for a moment. Then, from the far end of the corridor, from the direction of the ER, she heard a voice she recognized. Donna Haverford, talking to someone, using the specific tone that meant she had returned to the building and was already assessing damage and making lists and deciding what needed to happen next, which was exactly what Donna Haverford always did in the first 30 seconds of encountering any situation. Mara pushed off the wall again. "I'll start with her," she said, and walked toward the voice. She was 12 feet down the corridor when her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize, which was not unusual tonight. She answered it. The voice on the other end was not Solis, not Federal, not anyone from the operation. It was a man she didn't know, and he said 6 words in a tone so level it took her a full second to process what the levelness meant. "Dalton didn't make it to the van." She stopped walking. "The extraction team reached the bay window at 11:58, the voice continued. "Dalton wasn't there. The window was broken from the inside. Nobody on our side broke that window." She stood in the corridor of Harrow General at 4:23 in the morning, and the implications assembled themselves without her having to push them. The extraction hadn't been Gail's team. Someone else had taken Dalton out of Bay 3. And the documentation that Gail believed his team had retrieved from Dalton, the documentation that named 8 people, that made deals complicated, that was supposed to be the anchor of the entire case. "Where's the documentation now?" she said carefully. A pause on the other end that told her everything before the words did. "That's why I'm calling," the voice said. She didn't go back to Gail immediately. She stood in the corridor for 30 seconds and she thought, which was the fastest 30 seconds of thinking she'd done all night, and that was a high bar given the night. Dalton hadn't made it to a van. The documentation was missing, which meant one of 2 things. Either a third party had been operating inside this building all along, not Reeves's team, not Gail's, not Ellery's, or someone inside one of those 3 teams was not what they appeared to be. The window broken from the inside was the detail that mattered most. From the inside meant Dalton had been conscious enough to participate in his own extraction, which meant his condition at the time she'd stabilized him in Bay 3 had been better than his monitors suggested, or someone had stabilized him further after she left. The second thing it meant was that Dalton had chosen to go. He hadn't been taken. He'd left. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back toward Gail, and she walked with the specific economy of someone who is making decisions while in motion, which was the only way certain decisions got made. Gail was still in the corridor where she'd left him. He saw her face, and his own face changed register. "What happened?" he said. "Not a question. Dalton wasn't extracted by your team." A pause that was very short and very complete. "Say that again." "Your asset at the bay window. When did they confirm the extraction?" "Ket confirmed at..." He stopped, pulled out his phone, looked at the timestamp. "Ket confirmed at 12:04. What exactly did Ket say? Gail was already dialing. She watched him make the call, watched his face during it, and she read the answer in the way his jaw set before he lowered the phone. Ket confirmed the window was broken, and the room was empty, Gail said. She assumed our team had reached him first. Nobody assumed the other direction. No. His voice was careful in the way of someone being precise about something that had cost them. Nobody checked. Mara looked down the corridor toward the bay where the window of room 3 faced the east side of the building. He's been carrying that documentation for how long? We believe he received it 4 days ago. He's been moving since then. So he's had 4 days to memorize it. Gail looked at her. If Dalton chose to walk out of that window, she said, then he had a reason. And if the documentation is with him, then wherever he went, the documentation went. We don't know where he is. No, but he's a man who spent 4 days keeping something safe while someone tried to kill him for it. He's not going to disappear completely. She paused. He told me his name when he came in. Just his name. Not a cover, not a legend. He gave me his actual name, which is what people do when they're not sure they're going to be able to tell anyone anything later. But Gail was very still. You think he's going to surface? I think he surfaced once already to me in the 2 minutes before he lost consciousness. I think he knew what he was doing. She looked at Gail directly. I think the documentation is safer with him than it would have been in a chain of custody that Ellery had 4 years to compromise. The quiet that followed was the kind that arrives when someone has heard something they didn't want to hear and has recognized it as true anyway. The procurement network, Mara said. The 8 names. If Ellery had assets inside the federal structure. We don't know that. You don't know he didn't. She held his gaze. 4 years, Warren. He was operational for 4 years. That's long enough to know a lot of things he shouldn't know. Gail was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted. Not softer, but more considered. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that Dalton making his own exit might be the best thing that happened tonight. She paused. I'm also telling you that the case doesn't collapse without the physical documentation, because Dalton is the documentation. Everything on that drive is in his head. He has to be found first. He'll be found, she said, or he'll find you. Give it 72 hours. She didn't know that. She was making a read on a man she'd spoken to for 90 seconds while he was bleeding out, which was not a reliable sample size. But the read felt right, and in the absence of better information, a right-feeling read was what you operated on. Gail looked at her for a long moment. You've been doing this all night. Doing what? Making calls with incomplete information and being correct. I've been mostly correct, she said. I didn't account for the third vehicle. I didn't clock Ellery's entry point until he was already at the terminal. I held the wrong assumption about the extraction team for too long. She said it plainly, because pretending otherwise was the kind of thing that got people killed later. I've been mostly correct. That's different. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but she'd known him long enough to recognize it. Get checked out medically, he said. Properly. Not the back of an ambulance. I will. She meant it. Her ribs were making a strong case for follow-through. She turned and walked toward the sound of Donna Haverford's voice, which had gotten closer. Donna was standing at the entrance to the ER with a clipboard she had found from somewhere, and the expression of a woman who had been called back to her workplace at 3 a.m. and had arrived to find it cordoned, partially damaged, and full of federal personnel, and had decided that the correct response was to start a list. She saw Mara coming down the corridor, and she stopped mid-sentence to whoever she'd been talking to. Voss, she said. Donna. You look terrible. Bruised ribs. I'm fine. Donna looked at her for a moment with the comprehensive assessment of a nurse who could read a person's physical status faster than most physicians. Then she looked past Mara at the corridor, the cracked ceiling tile visible from here, the federal agents moving through the ER in the middle distance. The news is saying a nurse helped stop a terrorist attack on this hospital, Donna said. That's approximately what happened. They're not naming you yet. They will. Donna looked at her with an expression that Mara couldn't immediately categorize. Not surprise. Donna Haverford was not easily surprised. Something more layered than surprise. Your performance review, Donna said. 3 years ago, I wrote excellent stress management. I remember. I think I undercalled that. Mara almost said something and didn't. What she said instead was, there are things about my background that are going to come out. I should have told you before tonight. Should you have? I don't know. Probably not before tonight, practically speaking, but I'm sorry you're finding out this way. Donna was quiet for a moment. The clipboard was still in her hands, held at her side now, rather than in the active listing position. Were you ever going to say something? I don't know, Mara said, and that was the honest answer, and she let it stand as what it was. Donna looked at the ER. The emergency lighting, the state of a department she had managed for 15 years. The patients who were here tonight. Everyone got out. The ambulance bay, the south walkway. I checked with Solis. No civilian casualties. Solis? Federal agent running the scene. Donna absorbed that. Mrs. Garrett, she said, the dizziness patient in Bay 7. She was here when this started. She was moved with the first group. She's fine. The smallest exhalation. She's going to be furious about the television remote. It was such a specific, ordinary thing to say in the middle of everything else that Mara felt it land somewhere in her chest that hadn't had room for anything ordinary in the last 6 hours. She's going to have a much better story, Mara said. Donna looked at her again, and this time the expression was readable. The look of someone recalibrating a person they thought they knew and finding the distance between the two versions larger than expected and deciding how they felt about that. Your job is here if you want it, Donna said. Whatever comes out. Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the ER, the department she'd worked in for 3 years, the space that smelled like disinfectant and HVAC, and the particular institutional constancy of a place that was always open, always receiving, never closed to whoever came through the doors. I want it, she said. Donna nodded once. Then go get your ribs looked at and come back when you're cleared. She looked at the clipboard again, clicked her pen. We have a department to put back together. Dalton surfaced on the third day. He called the Van Cove field office at 11 in the morning, gave his name, and asked to speak to whoever was running the Ellery case. When Solis took the call, he spoke for 40 minutes. He was in a motel outside Caldwell, had been for 2 days, and he had spent those 2 days writing from memory every document, every transaction record, every name on the procurement network, reconstructed in the particular detail of a man who had been carrying this information for 4 days and had decided that his memory was the safest place for it. The written reconstruction ran to 63 pages. It named 8 people. It named Marcus Ellery as the operational coordinator. It named the 3 private contractors who had served as the transfer points for the diverted military hardware. And it named a senior procurement official in a federal agency who had signed off on the Shell transactions, whose name appeared on documents that had been routed through Ellery's network for over 6 years, and whose cooperation had made the entire scheme not just possible, but nearly invisible. Solis called Mara at noon on the third day to tell her. He mentioned you, Solis said. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting, the nurse caught me before I hit the floor and she didn't let go until she had to. I figured if she was worth that much of someone's attention, I could afford to trust her read on the situation. Mara sat with that for a moment. He's going to need a protective detail, she said. He has one. He negotiated it himself before he agreed to come in, which tells you something about the man. It told her several things about the man, all of them consistent with the 90 seconds she'd had with him in Bay 3. Which was more data than she'd had at the time and less than she'd needed, and had turned out to be enough. The arrests happened over 11 days. Not all at once. The case was too complex, the jurisdictions too layered, the legal architecture of the charges too intricate for a single coordinated action. It happened in pieces, each one reported separately, each one adding to the picture that the public was assembling from news coverage that was careful in some places and not careful in others. Marcus Ellery was charged federally on the second day. Terrorism, conspiracy to commit mass murder, illegal weapons trafficking, obstruction. The bail request was denied. He did not make a deal. The senior procurement official was arrested on the 6th day in his office at 10 in the morning with 3 agents and enough warrants to cover every file and device in the building. His name ran on every news outlet by noon. By 3 that afternoon, 2 of the other 7 names on Dalton's list had hired attorneys. By day 11, all 8 names had been charged. The 3 private contractors had their federal contracts suspended pending investigation. 1 cooperated immediately. The other 2 hired the same legal team, which told you something about how closely they'd been operating. Reeves received a reduced charge exposure in exchange for full cooperation, which had been the calculation he'd been running since the ambulance bay. His team got the same offer and took it. Mara gave 4 separate depositions over those 11 days. Each one lasted between 2 and 4 hours. Each one was conducted by a different attorney or agent working a different thread of the case, and each one asked her to reconstruct the same events from a slightly different angle, which was either the legal process working correctly or a test of consistency. And she passed it either way because she was telling the same story each time because it was what had actually happened. Her classified service record was accessed by federal investigators and reviewed under seal. The access was controlled, the disclosure limited to case-relevant information, and the specific operational details that remained classified stayed classified. What became part of the public record was a summary, carefully worded by people who had done this before. Prior service in a classified military support role with training in explosive ordnance recognition, tactical medicine, and hostile environment operations. It was accurate. It was incomplete. It was the version that could be said. The day the summary was released, Donna Haverford read it on her phone during a break between shifts and texted Mara 3 words, undercalled it again. Mara was in the middle of a medication run when the text came through. She read it standing in the supply corridor, in the same building where 6 days ago she'd crouched by a junction box and tripped a breaker in the dark. And she felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction and was something that existed between the two. The specific feeling of a truth that has been carried quietly for a long time, finally being set down somewhere it could stay. She put the phone back in her pocket and finished the medication run. The public story, when it fully assembled itself, was the kind that got told in a particular way. Nurse stops terror attack. That was the headline version, the 14-word version, the version that ran under photographs of Harrow General with the North Utility Corridor's fire damage visible in the upper left corner of the frame. It wasn't wrong. It was the way stories got condensed into the size that fit the format, which was always smaller than the actual thing and always left out the parts that were hardest to explain. What the headline version left out was the part where Mara had spent 3 years being a nurse, not as cover, not as waiting, as the actual work, the reason she'd left one life for another. The medication runs and the patient names and the 2 medication errors caught in the first month and Mrs. Garrett's television remote and the small specific accumulation of 3 years of showing up and doing the work that nobody photographed. It left out Petra, who had seen a man in the ceiling and told the right person. It left out Dr. Pell, who had intubated a patient under gunpoint and held her fury in both hands so it didn't cost anyone anything. It left out Donna Haverford, who had shown up at 3 a.m. with a clipboard and started a list. It left out Dalton, who had chosen the most dangerous possible form of trust, trusting a stranger in a crisis based on 90 seconds of evidence, and had turned out to be right. Stories always left things out. That was what stories did. The full version lived in the people who had been there, and it lived differently in each of them, and none of those versions were wrong. 6 weeks after the siege, Petra came back to Harrow General. Not as a patient. Her mother brought her for a reason that Sandra explained to the nurses' station with the slightly apologetic air of a parent who knows her child has made a specific request that is technically unusual and has decided to honor it anyway. She wanted to give this back, Sandra said. Petra was standing next to her, holding the stuffed rabbit with both hands, and when Mara came around the corner of the nurses' station, the girl walked forward without waiting for her mother to say it was okay. She held out the rabbit. Mara looked at it. "Benny doesn't want to live with me." "He wants to say thank you," Petra said with the complete seriousness of a child who has made a decision about how a thing should go. Mara crouched down so they were at the same level. The rabbit was well loved in the specific way of something that had been held through a significant amount of life. The stitching on one ear repaired, the fur on the nose worn down to bare fabric, one eye slightly off-center in a way that gave it a permanently thoughtful expression. "He can visit," Mara said, "but he belongs with you." Petra considered this. Then she pulled the rabbit back and held him against her chest. "Are you still going to be a nurse?" she said. The question landed with the directness that only children managed, not rhetorical, an actual inquiry, made because the answer mattered to the person asking. Mara thought about the depositions and the headlines and the classified summary and the name she was going to have to change and the process of becoming someone slightly different than she'd been, which was already underway and was not going to be simple. She thought about the medication run she'd finished an hour ago. The patient in Bay 2 who'd been admitted overnight and had asked her when she came in with his morning medications how she was doing, and had meant it, and had listened to the answer, and had said that sounds like a hard few weeks with the sincerity of someone who had nothing to gain from sincerity and was doing it anyway. She thought about the work, the specific, unglamorous daily necessity of it. "Yes," she said. "I am." Petra nodded as though this was the correct answer, and she had known it would be, but needed to confirm. Sandra touched her daughter's shoulder. "We should let her get back." Petra allowed herself to be guided toward the corridor, and at the last moment she turned back, not all the way, just enough to say over her shoulder, "Benny says you were very brave." Mara stood up. "Tell him so was he," she said. Mara worked the rest of that shift, and the one after it. She did the medication runs and the patient check-ins and the charting that needed to be done, and the 10 small decisions per hour that kept people stable and moving in the right direction. She caught a dosage discrepancy in Bay 4 that the overnight resident had missed, flagged it without drama, and moved on. She sat with an elderly man named Harold, who didn't have anyone coming to visit and who wanted to tell her about his garden. And she listened for 15 minutes she didn't technically have because some things mattered more than the schedule. Her ribs still hurt. They were going to hurt for another 2 weeks, which was the honest timeline of bruised ribs regardless of what you did, and she managed it the way she managed everything, directly, without performing otherwise. The name situation was in process. The paperwork was moving through the right channels. She would be someone slightly different administratively in a few months, and the badge would read a different name, and the specific cover identity that a man named Marcus Ellery had used for a call sign would be retired to whatever file it belonged in. She didn't have strong feelings about the name. She had strong feelings about the work. That was the thing that had been true at 22, when she'd first understood that the thing she wanted most was to keep people from dying, and it was true at 26 when she'd left one version of that work for another. And it was true at 29 in a hospital in Caldwell with bruised ribs and a deposition schedule and a charge nurse who had told her the job was hers if she wanted it. The people who had underestimated her. The gunman who'd made her a personal hostage because she looked manageable. The man in the data room who'd seen her badge and thought just a nurse. The 14-month operation that had used her name as incidental decoration had all made the same error. They had looked at the surface and read it as the whole thing. The surface was a nurse, quiet, dependable, good at charting, remembered patients' names. The whole thing was someone who had decided, at a crossroads, what she was willing to fight for and in what form. The fighting had looked like nursing. For 3 years, it had looked like nursing, and it had been nursing, because those were not contradictions. Because the woman who could neutralize a device in a basement was the same woman who sat with Harold and listened to him talk about his garden. And the common thread was not the skill set. The common thread was the orientation, the irreducible, persistent need to be the reason someone got to stay. She clocked out at 7 in the morning and walked to her car in the parking lot, where 6 weeks ago a gray van had transferred a detonator to a second vehicle and a man had made the worst decision available to him. The lot was quiet. The city was in the specific gray-blue light of early morning, when the night shift ends and the day shift hasn't fully arrived, and there's a gap that belongs to neither. She sat in her car for a moment, not from exhaustion, from the specific practice of sitting with something before moving on from it, something she had learned not in training but in nursing, from patients who had taught her that the space between one thing and the next deserved to be occupied properly. She thought about what had happened and what it had